Hello, Nick Leifker again, and welcome again to GMGT 590 Operations Management. We've talked about risk pooling and how, first, by possibly combining locations, we can reduce the amount of safety stock we may need, or by combining products, we may reduce the safety stock we need. What we're going to talk about next are, like I said, what I consider light versions of those first two. Now, both of these fall under lead time pooling because both of them pool lead times. It's just that they do it from different perspectives. First, we have what's known as consolidated distribution. The idea here is, suppose we have a long lead time from the supplier to each of our stores. Well, what's to stop us from putting in a distribution center so that distribution center orders from the supplier and has the long lead time? But the lead time from the distribution center to our individual store is far less. Now, to understand what's going on here, recall that good old formula for reorder point and safety stock. Well, lead time was an important part of that formula, wasn't it? So what happens if lead time goes from 8 days to 1? All of a sudden, the amount of safety stock that each store requires is far less. Now, it is important to note one thing. The overall lead time from the supplier to each store has actually increased from 8 to 9 weeks. However, by having this consolidated distribution, by having all of the product go from the supplier to this distribution center, the amount of inventory that each store requires is reduced, significantly reduced. In general, by doing this, we reduce retail inventory by as much as 50%. Now, it's not as effective as location pooling, but on the other hand, it does keep inventory near demand, so that's a good thing. So it allows customers to be close to the product, to experience the product, while still having the savings of risk pooling. Okay, as before, it's most effective if demand is negatively correlated across locations. In other words, suppose you have to decide between two stores to go to. You go to one store. This causes you to not go to the other store. This is a negative correlation. Greater sales at one location, lesser sales at another. It's also really effective if the lead time with the supplier is really long, but the lead time from the distribution center is really short. After all, we're trying to reduce the lead time here. That's the goal. There are other benefits, such as the advantage of purchasing for a whole bunch of different locations instead of one, and also transportation costs, transporting to one location instead of a whole bunch. Now, the other type of lead time risk pooling is what's known as delayed differentiation. And to understand what's going on here, let's go back to our wetsuit example. Now, you recall we were initially thinking about combining our dive wetsuit, our dive hammer, with our surfing wetsuit. Well, who's to say that we need to combine them into one product? How about we do this? We make generic hammers, generic wetsuits. They don't have any logo on them, but otherwise they're absolutely complete. And then, if someone orders surfing wetsuits, we just slap a surfing logo on it and send it on its way. If somebody orders diving wetsuits, we slap a diving logo on it and send it on its way. That way, we only have the inventory for the one product, for the universal wetsuit, if you will. But we can still sell these separate items, these separate surfing and diving wetsuits. So by doing this, we still have separate products. We're still able to serve separate customers, separate, different types of products here. But we have one pooled inventory. Again, like I was saying before, delayed differentiation is kind of like a light version of product pooling. In this case, you have the advantage of product pooling where, all the inventory is within one product, but you still have that advantage of separate products and selling to separate clientele. So, when does it make sense? Well, it makes sense if in cases where product variation occurs late in the production process. Suppose we're Hewlett-Packard and we make printers. We make printers for all over the world. We make printers for the US, we make printers for Europe, we make printers for Asia, we make printers for all over the world. What happens if we make printers for all over the world? We have to have different products for all over the world, right? Well, kinda. What we can do is the place where these differ, where these become different, is with the power source. After all, the United States has its plugs. Europe has several different types of plugs depending on where you live. Asia has several different types of power plugs depending on where you live. And as a result, if you serve all of these different markets, you have to have different products for them, but only with the power generation, only with the power source. So, what if we design our printers such that the power source is the last thing put in? So, product variation is created late in the production process. We have this universal product. We don't differentiate between them until the very end, until people order the product. Also, another thing that causes delayed differentiation to make sense. If the product variety can be added quickly and cheaply, we can iron on a logo, we can slap in a power source. And third, if the components needed for that variety are inexpensive compared to the generic component, compared to the wetsuit itself, compared to the printer itself. Well, a logo is a lot cheaper than a printer. The power source, that sounded really good. The logo is a lot cheaper than the wetsuit. The power source is a lot cheaper than the printer. So, under these conditions, we can consolidate the product into one inventory pool, one universal pool, and then separate them out into separate products as needed at the very end of the process. So, the last type of risk pooling that we're going to look at is a little different. Suppose we're Pontiac, and we've just put out the Pontiac Aztec, and we designed our production such that we can make thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Pontiac Aztecs. Yeah, this was a good idea, really it was. Anyway, so we have all this production, and if it's geared exclusively for Pontiac Aztecs, we're in trouble. Boy, are we in trouble. But suppose we design some flexibility into our production where, we don't have to make Aztecs from this particular line. We can make other things like, other GM products like a Chevy Tahoe or a GMC truck or something like that. Something else, anything else. Well, this is capacity pooling. What we do is we allow multiple facilities to be able to produce multiple products. That way we can adjust our production to better meet demand, and we don't have production that is tied into one specific type of demand. Thus, we can tailor our production to actually meet demand. Now, there are costs to this. After all, there are costs to having this flexibility. But if we play it right, those costs aren't that great. You see, with capacity pooling, a little bit goes a long way. So what we want to do is we want to sort of create chains of production where we have one process line that can produce two items. Then another process line that can produce one of those two items and then a different item. And then another process line that can produce another item and another, and that way we produce these chains of capacity pooling. That way we are able to shift production as needed to avoid idle time, to avoid lost sales from overproducing or from underproducing. So, how capacity pooling works. Suppose we have 4 factories. These 4 factories make 4 products and satisfy demand for 4 products. Now, we do our best to try to determine what demand is going to be. And we also do our best to try to create capacity, to develop capacity that matches that demand. So for each factory, we have a capacity, and hopefully that capacity is as close to that demand as possible. Now, again, we try to match capacity with demand as much as possible. Hopefully we're there. Hopefully we're right. But chances are we're probably wrong. We're not psychic. We try our best, but chances are our estimates of what demand is going to be probably isn't going to be absolutely right. So, what can we do? Well, if we have no capacity pooling, none whatsoever, there's basically nothing we can do. Factory 1 is going to be sitting there doing nothing, while Factory 3 isn't going to be able to meet demand. That said, what happens if we put in just a little bit of capacity pooling? Suppose Factory 1 can make product for Product 1 and Product 2, for instance, or Factory 2 can make product for Product 2 and Product 3. Suppose Factory 3 can produce for Product 3 and 4. Suppose Factory 4 can produce for Product 4 and Product 1. So, by putting in just a little bit of capacity pooling, we can adjust for this. We can adjust for the fact that demand for Product 1 is less than what we expected. We can adjust for the fact that demand for Product 3 is greater than what we expected. So, Product 1's demand was less than expected. So we just have Factory 1 make 60 items of Product 1, and then make 40 items of Product 2. That way, they're producing at capacity. So what does Factory 2 do? Well, Factory 2, part of its production is already taken by Factory 1, so it'll produce the rest of what's needed to satisfy demand for Product 2. So it makes 80. And then it takes the rest of its capacity, that remaining 40, and starts making Product 3. So now let's take a look at what's happened with Product 3. We've met the increase in demand for Product 3. We have 40 coming from Factory 2 and 60 coming from Factory 3. So, because of just this little bit of capacity pooling, this chain of products that these factories are able to make, we're able to adjust production in each of these factories such that what we produce is able to meet demand. Now, there are a couple of other things to remember. First of all, a little pooling goes a long way. You don't need to have every factory be able to make every product. What you want, again, are those chains, those chains of products between your factories, so that if one item has demand greater than expected, another item has less demand than expected, you can adjust your production across these factories accordingly. One other thing to remember, and that is flexibility generally costs money. So, in general, it's best to have just a little bit of flexibility in each factory, just enough to spread production out among the factories without having to spend money to have the capability of each factory to manufacture every product. So, in summary, risk pooling a little bit goes a long way. What you generally want to do is you want to reduce the total demand uncertainty by combining it. Effectively, the demand uncertainty of a bunch of means together, a bunch of averages together, is lower than the uncertainty of those averages individually. Now, and generally do not help reduce the inventory in the pipeline, but the goal is to reduce the inventory at the end, the product inventory that's available. So by doing this, risk pooling allows a company to have its cake and eat its too. In other words, have the service that they want to give to the customer without the cost of having the additional inventory that would normally be required. Thank you, and good luck.